Good morning, everybody, and thanks for being here. This is titled Building a Digital Doppelganger. Now, I think we've all probably had this phenomenon before where you're walking down the street and you see somebody that looks like a friend of yours and you talk to them, you're like, I think I just saw your doppelganger. I think I saw somebody that was your twin. We're taking this up a level because imagine if that twin, that doppelganger, was somebody you could use to try and assess your health before you ended up going through a procedure or taking drugs to see how they worked on your body. So we're going to talk about this, building a doppelganger with this esteemed staff here. So thank you guys very much for being here with us. This is going to be a great conversation. Here to my left, Kristen Myers. She's the Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering at Columbia University. To her left, Caroline Chung, Professor of Radiation Oncology and Diagnostic Imaging. She's the Vice President, Chief Data and Analytics Officer, and Co-Director of the Institute for Data Science in Oncology at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. You're the only one that had to do two sides of the thing for it. And David Hoganson, he's the Director of Computational 3D Visualization Program. I love that title. Boston Children's Hospital and a pediatric cardiac surgeon. Thank you guys for being here. Appreciate it. Let's start off at the top with the one thing, make sure that everybody understands it sitting here listening to this. What is a digital doppelganger?
I'm going to let you
any
the
one of
National
this.
Academy's report on digital. I think I was pulling the definitions from your report.
Yeah, so I had the privilege of co-authoring the report from the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine on digital twins. It came out at the end of 2023. And a digital doppelganger, I have no idea what that is.
And it was interesting when we had a pre-conversation. We do this a couple weeks before, get together with everybody so we can just talk about the nuances of being here at Aspen. And I tell people, don't wear suits, don't wear ties. It's very casual. Make sure you wear comfortable shoes. You're at high altitude. And one of the things I brought up is I don't necessarily like the word doppelganger because doppelganger in German means.
It's an apparition that's supposed to present an omen of bad luck to you. Definitely not where we're going with applying digital twins in medicine. We're hoping that this is actually going to be a beacon of information, hope, and directions that we get better informed to give you personalized treatments.
And that's the basic bottom line behind this, right? Is get that personalized treatment because right now, when we treat somebody, if we're doing surgery on somebody, if we're giving them medicine, chemotherapy, as doctors, it's often an educated guess of this works for most people, let's try this on you. But we're going into that era of, some people like the wording, some people don't, individualized medicine. How can we do that on the next level of making sure that medicine is individualized to you, and not just to you, but to the specific organ we're talking about? Is that what we're thinking here?
Yeah, and it can range from a specific illness that you have. It could be, for instance, I'm an oncologist, so we look at modeling digital twins of tumors themselves and how they would respond to treatment. It could be an organ, and you'll hear about several different organ systems and digital twins that we're actually leveraging. And now we have a global consortium of researchers who are actually looking at digital twins of entire humans. So how do you actually piece all this organ system information when you go and get your blood tests and your cardiac tests and your lung x-rays? How do we put that all together to create a digital rendition of you so we can actually anticipate how you'll respond to certain drugs or certain treatments? And we know which ones will cause you more side effects versus others. So we can actually select the right treatment for you and actually potentially run through simulations in the office and say, hey, if we did this, this is what the outcome would look like. Is that acceptable, not acceptable? And can we actually walk through those permutations and come up with a plan together to say, this is the best treatment plan that we've decided on together? And I think it really empowers both you as a patient as well as the physicians in the room working with you.
And by digital, we're truly meaning digital. We're truly meaning something that is on a computer that you can use for simulations, you can use for testing.
Yeah. Let me sort of ground my comments. I'm a mechanical engineer, structural engineer. I'm from Detroit. I used to be an automotive engineer, working in car factories, putting together automatic transmissions where multiple parts come together as an assembly, and they have to perform a function. In that industry, in automotive, in aerospace, they use these digital renditions of the parts coming together so they can de-risk their products. As Caroline says, can we run through multiple what-if scenarios with this digital rendition of a physical object based on data from sensors, from measurements, from everything from a caliper to now medical imaging from radiology, put that into a digitized version of itself on the computer and ask what if. Because like I said, you have an assembly, many moving parts. So in cars, it's mostly rigid parts against rigid parts. In the heart and in the brain, I study human pregnancy. It's soft tissue on soft tissue on soft tissue. That's very complex. So when we talk about these digital twins, we have to include sort of, we call these multi-scale, multi-physics phenomena. David and I were talking about fiber orientation when he goes into surgery. And I love this partnership of this panel because I feel like surgeons are like, they're like mechanical engineers with sensors on their hands. They can see that structure. But imagine if you were a patient, particularly a pregnant individual who doesn't know what's going to happen with their pregnancy. And talk about not knowing. In obstetrics, it's mostly a wait and see type of scenario. So we hope, like you said, is this individualized medicine? Yes, but because there's such a data lag in women's health and maternal health, if you were just at the women's health talk, it's difficult. We have to use cohort models sometimes. So in another dimension for a singular organ, can we then get a demographic read of who you are, but then add personalized bits from your ultrasound, perhaps from something that we can capture from maybe, hopefully, the cervical vaginal microbiome, that we can inform data into these digital renditions of the human body.
And David, she brings up a great point. When it comes to surgery, we are not all built the same. This is not like a car where that bolt is going to be in the same place on everybody, same torsion, same everything. It helps you as a surgeon before you go in there to know where the things are.
Yeah, I mean, it's really been totally transformational in how we've approached pediatric cardiac surgery and other areas of surgery as well. Everybody's different, and particularly in congenital heart defects, every child's different. So you can't just have one plan, one patch, one repair that works for everybody. So we've been able to individualize this and make personalized three-dimensional models of individual patients, and then within their own anatomy, plan those repairs. And it's totally changed how we've thought about what we've been able to do and how consistent we are in delivering an excellent surgical result. But I think it extends beyond that, not only in individual patients, but also to populations. And one of the areas we've really worked at is how to use these digital twins and simulation as part of clinical trials. And so historically, we've used huge cohorts of real patients, but now we're able to use simulations to use even bigger cohorts of patients that we've modeled after normal disease and understand how's this drug or how's this device going to work in these patients, and then use a much smaller cohort of real patients and reduce the cost, the timing, and hopefully the efficacy of the clinical trial so the FDA can make a better decision about what to do. So there's so many applications which are exciting.
Yeah, and we've actually been using it even before we get to the clinical trial as we're trying to discover new drugs for cancer, for instance, and modeling. I'm sure many of you have heard of AlphaFold. It was on many of the headlines that you can actually predict how these proteins will actually fold up. Using technology like that to actually simulate out what are the targets that we could actually target for certain cancers. What are the types of drugs that would actually potentially work? Which ones would potentially be better absorbed through the gut, through an oral mechanism? And then transitioning those digital twins that are at this individual molecule level to a cellular level to see how that would actually absorb to an organ level, and then getting to patients and populations, actually run through and simulate drug development before we actually do the drug trials. And hopefully, if this is all successful, it becomes very efficient, could we actually start to reduce the amount of time it takes for us to get new drugs approved?
And you mentioned the FDA. There's the FDA Modernization Act, where we want to reduce our use of animal models. And so really having ex vivo physical systems, and they say digital systems as well, yes, digital twins, to help sort of accelerate R&D and reduce cost and de-risk products.
And you bring up a good point earlier. My first career was as a pilot in the Air Force. And this is back in, dating myself, back in the early 80s. We used simulation back then. Lots of simulation. My degree was also mechanical engineering. We used simulations there on looking at the wing structures, the structures of a wing, things like that. We're talking about 1980s. Now you fast forward to 2025. Where are we in medicine with digital twins? Is this the infancy of that? Are we pretty much into it and we're getting close to where we want to be? Where are we with all this?
We're still at an infancy, I would say. The thing is that I think when it comes to physical structural simulations, we're getting there. Obviously, the soft tissue versus hard, rigid mechanical parts where the laws of physics are a little bit easier to anticipate and model is one leap. But the second leap that is much harder is bringing biology and physics together. So there's a lot of chemical reactions happening in each of us, and to be able to model what is exactly happening, what is that molecular pathway, well, in a lot of situations, we're still trying to figure that out. And so there aren't established laws of biology that we can necessarily always hang our hat on. There are certain areas where we have better understandings, and other areas where it's still somewhat of a black box. But it's actually motivating for the scientists to actually go down and answer those gaps, that we can actually fill that in to actually build out the digital twins in more meaningful ways.
Yeah, I would say in many ways we're playing catch up with the aerospace and the automotive industry, where simulation is the gold standard. You know, now cars are made and designed with no physical prototypes at all. The first one was the BMW 6 Series, not a single prototype. They designed it, they simulated it on the computer, they did all the testing digitally, they built the factory, and the first prototype was the first car. And that's where simulation's at in those industries. And so what we're doing is using that same software that aerospace uses to design how the airflow is going to go over the wings. We use that exact same software to understand how the blood's going to flow through the heart with this surgical option or this surgical option or this surgical option, and then we can decide, you know, this is the best one, and these are not going to work. And so it's really, you know, capitalizing on what's become the gold standard in those industries and now applying it to medicine. But I agree, we're at the tip of the iceberg as far as what we can do.
I think one of the biggest challenges is that when you think about the automotive industry, you actually want every 6 Series to look the same and come out and have quality control. We can all say that none of us are going to look like an identical person, and so that's a big challenge, that we're really working with a different special entity in each circumstance. So.
And beyond that, are there reasons that we are behind the automotive industry, the aviation industry? Is it because it seems to me like it takes, you know, you have to have the computational power to be able to get there. You have to have this interaction between physicians, researchers, engineers to get there. You have to have that data available and shared. What are the stumbling blocks that have kept us from getting to that point?
You mentioned all of them. And
yes.
I want to say in automotive, in an Aeroastro, and this came up in your report, which I love as a mechie who trains mechanical engineers who go out into these companies, validation, verification, and uncertainty, right? Like we're saying, like every, you know, a GMC Terrain comes off looking the same. But again, we're the beauty of human beings is we're all different, and we all react to biology and environmental exposures differently. And to talk about like where we are in infancy and digital twinning, I look up to these people in oncology and cardiology. I'm in women's health and maternal health and pregnancy. I didn't even know what we call it elasticity, the property of how things stretch, right? And we all can kind of understand that with our skin, and aging's really popular. People put a lot of money into that. But think about the human uterus, which is the size of, you know, your fist. It can grow and shrink in aging. But imagine that in human pregnancy, that has to grow and stretch and grow and stretch and grow and stretch. What are the biophysical properties that I do use to put into my digital twin? So in my laboratory, we take tissues from animal models and also humans who have to have hysterectomies, and we put them in our biomechanical stretching machines. And David was saying in surgery, you know, you have to pay attention to the direction in the fibers. No one has atlased that before for the uterus or the cervix, which is a structure that I came to and really fascinated with. So in maternal health, we are, I mean, to use the pun, we are in its infancy completely. But I think seeing the excitement and medical imaging technology and what we can do with ultrasound, quantitative MRI, taking medical imagery and pipelining it into a digital twin, right, that you see just right at your exam. My hope for a pregnant individual is that at their first trimester scan, when you discover you're pregnant and you're a new mom, you don't know what's going to happen, is with that first ultrasound or for that first visit, we can have a predictive model and say, hey, we're not really sure, maybe your cesarean section scar, you might be at risk for X, Y, and Z. Why don't we put biophysics behind that? We figured it out for cars and airplanes. Yeah. Right? We landed at Aspen Airport a couple days ago, and I was like, that wing is going to fly right off. Like, we figured a lot of great things out, but in medicine, we're so far behind, and I can't stress enough about maternal health.
Yeah, and I think I had an interesting conversation with the CEO of Dassault Systems, which is one of the leading software companies in the aerospace simulation area, and he said, the difference that was made in the aerospace industry is when they started doing tests to inform the math behind the simulations. What's the property of the airplane wheel? What's the property of this? What's the property of that? Instead of trying to test the whole prototype. And we've done the same thing, just as you noted, with the mechanical tissues of the aorta, the pulmonary artery, of the heart valves, and bringing those things in. And so we're walking the same path. We're just a couple decades behind.
And you haven't, go ahead.
But to your point, I think one of the big gaps is the data. So data around the understanding of the structures and the actual modeling itself, but also just the heterogeneity of the data. So that, not everyone is going to go get their tests at the same time, at the same window of time. There may be distance issues. There may be different technologies that are doing the measurements. So you might go from one scanner to another, and those measurements are not actually the same. And so that lack of data or the differences in data is actually making it very difficult. And that's one thing that I think that we can systematically start to address.
And, it was interesting. I had a conversation today about this topic, and during the pandemic, when I was covering the changes in the pandemic on TV, one of the difficulties we had was actually getting that data, because there's no data sharing especially between hospital systems and their computers. The data's out there, it's just the data sharing is an issue. Is that the same hurdles you guys are?
The data sharing is difficult, but I would also say that in my role now and talking across different organizations, it's not only the fact that even if we had every will to want to share and work together and we got all of the legal paperwork, once you actually start looking, the data in one hospital looks very different from the data in another hospital. So when you're going from one system to another, and you may say your information's getting connected, it's getting connected, but does it actually mean the same thing at each hospital? Because they're defining some of their measurements differently. And this happened during the pandemic. The number of days someone stayed in hospital, did you know that there were over 10 ways that you could define the number of days someone stayed in hospital? It seems pretty straightforward, but some hospitals were counting it at the stroke of midnight, being at 1 day. So if you were admitted at 11:59 p.m. and it struck midnight, you were in the hospital for a full day. In another hospital, it was a 24-hour stay. In another hospital, it was based on shifts. And so if you actually do this and you say you're comparing apples to apples, you're actually not, because these measurements are completely different. So that interoperability and the ability to actually translate across the different hospital systems is just as much of a challenge as the actual ability and willingness to share.
I have a good digital twin data sharing story, because we've been making CAD models. These are computer aided design, your basic simplistic 3D rendering of a cervix and a uterus in pregnancy. I have a large library of them. I had an NIH funded study. I can't give the biomedical device company I'm working with, I can't give them the ultrasound. But what I can give them is the digital twin of the structure. So we've been sharing that. We have an open library at Columbia University Libraries. I've just been opening up and lowering the barrier of access to the data that we have privilege to working at our big hospital systems. But I want more engineers in this space. Not a lot of engineers can walk over, take an ultrasound of a patient, and then have this privileged data. So again, having that digital twin or simulated version of a population of patients that I've studied and giving that to the scientific community. Like, I know we're not going to get to the big prize really soon, but really these research byproducts that are happening in creating digital twins is going to be really powerful.
What's the goal here? What's the ultimate goal with digital twinning?
I think that was actually called out in the report. There is not one ultimate goal of creating a digital twin. Creating a digital twin for the sake of creating a digital twin is not a very good exercise. So we actually call out that it needs to be fit for purpose. So what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Is it that you're trying to predict certain complications in pregnancy or guide a surgery? We're going to build a twin that will address that need. You may not actually go through all of the biochemistry in the heart, because that's not necessarily what your focus of that twin is. Whereas if we're looking at drug metabolism, we may need to go through all of that biochemistry and modeling. And so it really depends on how you actually want to use the twin. Many hospitals are using some level of twinning, whether they call it twinning or not, to anticipate things like supply chain or operations, and they call it process engineering. Process engineers come in and optimize how your hospital is running. You could technically say, if you're going to simulate all of those things and make decisions and make other measurements, you've got a functioning digital twin. So I think it really depends on what you're ultimately trying to create. I would think that the majority of people, when you talk about healthcare and digital twins, everyone wants to have this digital hologram of you, like on Star Trek. And I think that maybe that is sort of one of the ultimate goals. There's a whole global consortium working towards that goal. But again, I think that if we want to start to really be thoughtful about which data points do we need to really focus on, start to connect through, we have to know what we're actually going to use it for.
So the goal is going to depend on what we need to use that goal for.
Mm-hmm. I have 3 goals with my digital twins. One is diagnosing preterm birth, which happens in 1 in 10 pregnancies in the United States, 1 in 10. Is there going to be a mechanical failure of the uterus or the cervix that might drive the risk for preterm birth? So working with my physicians, seeing how the cervix is a mechanical barrier. I think I'm within 5 years of that, I hope.
Really?
2 is designing new therapeutics. Let's say the cervix is at risk for opening too soon and too fast. The only medical technology we have is a surgical stitch of the cervix close. I tell people it's like taking dental floss, wrapping it around your pinky and pulling tight, okay? That was designed, I think in the 50s or 60s. That's the only tool we had. We've had drugs, we've had other devices come on and off the market in the last 15 years, nothing. So that's one goal, and I'm working with a company who has a small business grant from the NIH. My 3rd goal as a mechanical engineering professor is to seeing is believing. That's why I'm a Mechie. I was never electrical because I couldn't see the electrons flying around, but I can see a structure stretching to over 300% its size, and I'm teaching young engineers who are obsessed with aerospace, they're obsessed with robotics. I was like, hey, look at this structure in the human body. And then, so it's an educational tool that I use on digital twins, and then we get to talk about the fun stuff in anisotropy and stuff that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think fundamentally we're trying to make a difference in the lives of our patients, right? This is about patient outcomes. For us, this is about getting a surgery perfect in a baby so they have a normal life, right? Instead of having a complication or not surviving. And, but I think that translates to orthopedic surgery, neurosurgery, and it's all the same, right? How do you do what we can do some of the time? How do you do it nearly perfectly every time, have consistent outcomes, and really, change the outcomes of individual patients and entire, disease processes.
Yeah, and I think that in the oncology space, we have several different digital twins we're actually working on now. One example is in I treat brain tumors, so we actually have a model of a brain tumor that would use your own MRI data that gets fed in, so it becomes your brain tumor and behavior, and we're actually using serial MRIs to actually inform personalizing the radiation treatment to actually minimize side effects in the rest of the brain and preserving cognition while actually really attacking where we know that the tumor is going to behave aggressively. That's one example. Another one is a very different kind of use case, is that if you get diagnosed with early prostate cancer, there are many people who get diagnosed these days that may not actually need treatment. They can go on active surveillance and they come in for a test. Well, every time you come in for a test, it causes a certain level of anxiety because it's inconvenient to come in for a test. They're not pleasant tests. I don't think any man in the
Potential side effects.
Potential side effects. And you have the anxiety of waiting for the result of the test. And so we started to look at, can we actually simulate out and get your individual information to say, actually, you're good for the next 2 years. You don't need to come in every 6 months and just stay on schedule every year and stay on schedule. Perhaps it'll get to a point where you're good. We don't need to see you for another 5 years for this particular test. Whereas someone else who normally would have waited 6 or 12 months, maybe they should have come in at 3 months because we would have caught something. And so starting to personalize that follow-up.
Risk stratification is really a big goal. It's that in pregnancy care, a lot of patients are placed at these high risk, like your uterus might over distend. Your cervix might be at risk of opening because it's too short. As a mechanical engineer, I was like, well, it's short. Is it made out of steel or is it made out of butter, right? And those are 2 different mechanical properties, and even physicians have sort of an idea of how soft things get. So if we had a tool and a digital twin, like in structural engineering, to say, hey, actually 4 weeks from now, yeah, it might open, so maybe that cerclage procedure is best for you. Or, hey, you have a short cervix, but actually it's really strong. And maybe through quantitative imaging, we can say, actually, the fibers are oriented this way, and yeah, go live your life. Reduce that stress about the unknown, and get rid of the wait and see, and have it really be for predictive risk calculation.
And I think, especially from a physician perspective, and obviously from the patient perspective too, like you mentioned, getting rid of that unknown is a
Yeah.
huge step forward, and this seems like it could help with that. And David, I know you have an example because sometimes it's hard to visualize what we're talking about when it comes to this digital twinning. Do you want us to show that?
Sure. Yeah, I sent John
It's a GIF
just a quick video. This is the operation
or GIF, depending on how you.
Friday. So this is a patient-specific 3D model of an infant's heart with the ventricles in gray and the other blood vessels in different colors. And we can look inside the heart, and this is inside the right ventricle in purple. You can see into the left ventricle in orange, a big hole between the pumping chambers we had to close. And then if you look inside the atria, this child has very abnormal drainage of the blood back to the heart. And so the teal vessels are all in the wrong spot where the blood comes back from the body, and then the pink vessels where blood comes back from the lungs. We have to divert those teal vessels all to the left side of the screen and the pink vessels all to the right. So what we did is we designed a patch to divert that left superior vena cava over to the right atrium, and to get all the blood flow from the body to go to the right atrium, and then another patch to separate the atria and the two sides to make sure all the pink blood went into the left atrium. And so we plan these patches out, and you'll see then we mathematically flatten them, as you'll see there, and then we transfer those into the operating room. So we have this laser that we got from the aerospace industry, where the laser projects the patch design down onto the sterile patch materials. We trace it out, cut it out, and sew it in. So there's no guesswork. It's not going to be wrong. It's the same every time. And this is a really tiny baby. This is a 17-pound infant. The whole heart's about that big. So these patches are really little. The margin for error is nothing. And so this has really totally transformed how we can plan, conduct, and make these operations as perfect.
So prior to this, what would it have entailed? Opening?
I mean, you do the imaging, and then as a surgeon in the operating room, you open the heart, and then you make it up as you go. And, and that's, certainly the more you've done it, the more you've seen, the better you can be. This is a complex child with heterotaxy syndrome and a AV canal with systemic venous abnormality. There's maybe a dozen centers on earth who would tackle this operation. Not a lot of surgeons have done 50 of these, right? So how do you do this almost perfectly, even if you're at a place that doesn't do a ton of these? So it's really been a dramatic change.
That's amazing, especially given a child that small to be able to do that beforehand. And we're talking about expanding this to pretty much everybody.
Absolutely.
Before you go in.
Yeah. So
same with oncology.
Yeah, the goal is how do you make this available to all patients who need it, not just the patients who can come to the few centers who really do it now.
Mm-hmm.
And Carol, I know you had a slide. Did you want us to go over that, showing?
Sure, we can show the slide. This is just an example within the report, because I was co-author. I put in a cancer patient example. You can see how a digital twin would work for you. So we've got the patient and the physician right in the middle. It's an infinity diagram because it journeys with you through your entire journey. And you could start with before the diagnosis of cancer to do preventative measurements. But basically, you've got the physical rendition of you, so that's you at the top, with all the tests that you might have in your EHR, and the data flows into this model, this digital model down at the bottom. And you've got the QR code for the report. You want to see this in more detail later. So the digital twin itself can actually simulate all different kinds of predictions for treatment. And the third example that I have in terms of that prediction for treatment, although this is a brain tumor example, is we actually use, the really exciting pieces, we actually use drugs that are already approved. I know we're always excited at that next piece of discovering the next therapy, but there are a lot of drugs that we already have approved that are at our fingertips that we can actually use today. We know that they're safe because we've been using them in humans. But we took chemotherapy drugs for breast cancer in patients, and we modeled exactly the same total dose of drug that we'd normally give as part of standard of care treatment. And then we started to manipulate the scheduling and how that drug was delivered. So we tried 1,000 different ways. Some of them, the hospital system said, that's impossible. We're not going to have someone come in for infusions 4 times a day. Like, that's just not going to happen. So we had to think of realistic, feasible delivery options. But as we started to walk through these different schedules, the survival rates started going up. And so now we're saying, well, can we actually use the drugs we have today and start to think about, for you, because of your blood pressure and how your heart rate is and what you're doing, we're going to give you your chemotherapy in this way to give you your best chances versus the standard way. There's a good proportion of people who actually benefit from the standard way, so we're not going to change that, but we can start to adjust, and we start to go around, and this is an infinity loop, because once you've gone through that simulation and decided what that best option is. Then we go back and start measuring and saying, did that work? Did that not work? Do we need to make another adjustment? Do we use that model to predict that next step? And so this digital twin is intended to actually journey with you through that journey.
You know, we may never get to that Star Trek type situation where our body's there and we can look at it and use it for medical purposes like we need to, but to even get to these next steps we're talking about, what's it going to take?
I would say that there's several things that were called out in the report. So one is the multidisciplinary team needs to be redefined.
Engineers, doctors.
We need engineers alongside the physicians. It's very symbolic.
Yeah, one of those icons in your infinity loop. I'm like, that's a different team. That's a different team.
Yes.
They don't necessarily talk together.
That's right. We need to start to think about how all of the data that we have around us, I'm sure many people are wearing smartwatches. How do we actually integrate that into the data that we get off our medical scans? How do we integrate that off of, there's now research saying, you know, the way that you speak, the speed at which you speak, where you take your pauses, can give you some preliminary signals of how your brain is functioning. So if you start to integrate all of these different signals in a meaningful way, then we can start to actually, but we need to make sure that we can calibrate this, because like I said, just because we're smushing all the data together does not actually mean you're going to make any sense out of it. So you need to start to capture the data in a consistent way. We can actually flow it in a meaningful way. But that would mean breaking down barriers between all the different industry vendors, all the different hospital systems, and so really having that collective community to come together to say that this is where we need to go.
Good.
Oh, so much on team science principles. We're from all different fields, and just, you know, just kind of slowing down and just being like, what do you mean by that definition? Because in your field, plasticity might mean something different. In my field, plasticity means that I yielded a material. Brain plasticity means something else. And I think being together here, multidisciplinary, so this convergence of science and slowing down, asking for definitions. I mean, it takes my team, thankfully my lab is across the street from L&D, taking my engineering students with me. We have the privilege of being bedside in ultrasounds, talking to the sonographers on how they capture the measurements. Actually, when I was pregnant myself, I noticed that they loved ultrasounding the baby a lot. You know, every standard of care visit, and as an engineer, I was like, well, if we just spend 16 more minutes here, and I can train the sonographer, I can do a maternal anatomy scan, because we do fetal anatomy scans. That's the standard of care, 20 weeks of gestation. If I spent 15 more minutes, I know it's cheap, I can take 16 caliper measurements and create a digital twin. Not the most high resolution. David's digital twin's beautiful, by the way. I'm in awe of it. I want one for the uterus and the placenta. That is a goal that we should get to very soon. But convergence, team science, talking to each other, making sure we understand definitions, making sure that we have validation verification, that what I simulate, what I take this uterus and I expand it to the size of full gestation, if my OB walks in and says, Kristen, what are you doing? That does not look right, right? Having that measure of quality and verification really has to be, and we don't have standards right now. We have, you know, in automotive, in aerospace, they have standards. I think there's people coming together, talk about biomedical device design standards, the digital twin you use, the data it comes from, the provenance. All this needs to be discussed.
Yeah, please go ahead.
We have been working at a national level to start to standardize how we capture data, both in the EHR, in our electronic health records, and kind of coming to a consensus of how do we actually capture this more consistently, because it is being called out as a challenge for AI models as well as the future of digital twins. And we've also been trying to come together as a community. There was a day one proposal that I helped co-author as well in terms of looking at imaging and how variable the imaging is. So you may not realize, and I think most people think imaging devices cost millions of dollars, they're really fancy, you have to go to a special room and it's all shielded and protected. So you'd imagine that when you went and got a CT scan or an MRI, that it should be the same wherever you go. There's some level of consistency. Well, the reality is there isn't. The protocols that the different companies, the different hospitals use can be different. The companies make devices slightly differently. There is more transparency coming down from a regulation standpoint, but there are legislations that are needed for us to make sure that these measurements really are consistent so we can make the most use of them. I think the uncertainty piece, that whole infinity diagram and that journey and that decisioning, it's great and it's super exciting, and that's why we're here and we want to do this. At the same time, if you think about what happens if that prediction was wrong and we made a decision, we have to kind of pause and say, well, how much uncertainty do you have and what's okay? And that I can still say, this is better than nothing, to your point, that a surgeon will go in there and figure it out as you go. But at the same time, you don't want information that's going to mislead you and have you stuck somewhere where you're really not prepared. So
yeah, and I think that, the focus on, validation and certainty quantification is super important, especially because we are in an early stage of this, and, it's important to develop that trust with the community, right? And so we worked closely with the FDA. They put out, guidelines for medical devices and how to use simulation in medical devices for quantifying the credibility of that simulation. So we've worked with the FDA to adapt that to the patch planning that you guys just saw, as well as the flow simulation. And I go from here to California to present our validation data using MRI for all the patients we did flow simulation on before their surgery to say this is the right operation, and we say the flow balance to the lungs is going to be this and this. And then we do MRI afterwards to show, as engineers, we want to say, did what we say was going to happen. And so, we've been very diligent to do those simulations carefully, and the results are astounding. We have less than 8% error, 7% error between the predicted flow balance by computational fluid dynamics and the MRI of the patient after surgery. So it's really become quite a trusted workflow for us. And, and I think, to your point of how do we expand this, I started in industry as an engineer, and so when we started to do this, I said, we're going to have to change how we think about accomplishing this within the healthcare setting. And so we've hired a team of engineers that has grown and grown and grown, and now we have 18 engineers at Boston Children's Hospital. We have 10 cardiac surgeons. We have 18 engineers, which is remarkable. But the engineers are not engineers in an ivory tower. These are engineers in the hospital. They go into the operating room to watch the surgeries that they've planned the patches for, done the flow simulation for. It's a constant feedback, and those engineers really have to come. It's not meeting in the middle. Surgeons are not going to come halfway to the engineer, right? The engineers have to come basically all the way to the surgeon and really truly understand the challenges, the opportunities, because engineers think differently than surgeons. And so it's really been, how do you create a team to do this and to make it sustainable? So we've tackled billing. Now we're billing as part of this effort, so it gets paid just like any other, part of the medical care. So I think there's a lot of elements to that to make this really a standard approach, but a big part of it is the team.
And the big question, which I think is the question just about for every panel we've had here, how important is funding for this?
Incredibly important. And I think that it's not only, there's often funding to actually start the program, but remember what I said, that the infinity loop needs to keep going. If that doesn't continue, the sustainability of that digital twin is going to cost money as well. And if you stop flowing the information, that digital twin basically dies. And so we can't just build it and have it, it's not a physical structure that's just going to stand there. We're going to have to make sure that we have a sustainability plan for these as well.
We need funding at every level of the value chain, from science for science sake, discovery driven, so that's National Science Foundation, bread and butter. What does a uterus look like? What is it made out of? What's its mechanical properties? So we've been successful with the NSF atlasing basic biomechanical properties of the female reproductive tract because it's not in the literature. And to make a digital twin, you need the data. And then all the way to the National Institutes of Health, who are like, okay, take those ideas and translate that. And then even using the small business grant mechanisms within the NSF and NIH. I think this is a great time for industry to step in. He has a partnership with Dassault, these big companies who have the infrastructure, the computational power, the AI, the know-how, a bunch of engineers who can jump in on these projects. It has to keep going. The entire pipeline needs to be funded. The R&D infrastructure, I'm really afraid of companies just kind of dropping that R&D and being like, oh, let's just all do industry, et cetera. We still need discovery-driven work, hypothesis-generating work. So I think every part of the value chain is absolutely important. I can't just pinpoint one.
And just going back to the data and actually implementing in clinics, we can actually reach everybody. That's going to be a big investment. And I call it a true investment because I think it can help transform healthcare. It can help transform the way we actually make our decisions and improve outcomes. But it's going to require a big change in what we're doing today, and then that will require investment.
And I think industries who appreciate R&D, I've been on the phone with like companies like Whoop in Boston. They have a whole women's health R&D team. They appreciate science for science sake and partnering with universities to de-risk ideas because they know those ideas are going to be, they're going to be inventions, they're going to be patents. It's going to drive their growth in their company. So that bread and butter R&D. So I think partnering with industry partners who have that R&D mindset is going to be really important to bridge some gaps that we might be facing in the coming years.
And David?
Yeah, no, I think it was interesting as we did 20 3D models of patients our first year and then 45 the second year, we soon found ourselves in a little bit of a no man's land for funding because it was clinical work. These were real patients getting care. The NIH doesn't fund that. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a clinical trial. It's not 100% FDA approved software. You can't necessarily do that as a formal clinical trial. And so we actually benefited dramatically from philanthropic funding from individuals who said, we're going to partner with you. We believe this is going to make a difference in the lives of children. And now we're going to do over 50% of the cardiac surgeries at Boston Children's this year are going to have a 3D model. It's become the standard of care. But we went from 20 patients to going to do 600 this year over the course of about 8 years. But a lot of that was finding funding from all sorts of sources, including philanthropic, to try to bridge that gap.
It's interesting when we talk about automotive and the aerospace industry, a lot of money goes into R&D in those industries, private money, and that's why they're making these advances in airplanes, cars, all those things. But let me open up for questions here, see if anybody has any questions. Ma'am, back there?
Hi, Carly Sadeghi. Thank you so much for this panel. This technology is amazing and fascinating, and I'm thinking about the implementation side of it. So, you had talked about assumed error rates and all of that, and obviously I would think that you can say, there's human error and that this may help eliminate some of that. But from a risk mitigation standpoint, I'm curious how hospitals will feel about it, because if medical malpractice is really hard to prove in current cases, if you have some sort of technology where you can pinpoint to the exact protocol that was done and maybe something went wrong, does that open up such litigation that there may be hesitation? So I'm curious about sort of that implementation and risk assessment side.
Yeah, I can tell you I was just at the AMA meeting because we're trying to get CPT codes approved for this, and we've been on this path. And this came up in AMA conversations with Congress and a congressional session, more so with AI tools, but it absolutely applies to the simulation and the stuff we do. And basically the Congress said, it's 100% clear. The risk and the responsibility rests with the physician. And so this is additional information at every level. And the physician has to make a medical decision how to use that information as part of the total picture of how to care for that child. Even when I'm using those patches, I still have to make a judgment at every moment. Is this patch fit with everything I know? So. I think for now that's what Congress says is where we're at, which is clear. But obviously all of these are in their infancy as we move forward.
I think that's where the uncertainty quantification is. The physicians making the decisions want to see that. They want to see what that range of certainty there is. Mm-hmm.
For sure.
Other question? Yes, ma'am?
Great panel. My name is Holly Lisenby. You said that surgeons think differently than engineers, or vice versa. What if you had a surgeon who was an engineer? That's the big idea behind the new school that we're building at Arizona State University of Medicine and Advanced Medical Engineering, where we will have dually trained individuals. Yes. So my question for the panel is, what does the industry ecosystem look like today to support not just the R&D to develop and validate digital twins, but to ultimately deploy it clinically? Because if there are gaps in that industry ecosystem now, where should we be going to, with VC or new codes to really be prepared for what's coming down the line with digital twins?
Yeah, so I am a surgeon who's an engineer, and that's been super helpful. And people have said, well, how did you get the surgeons to do the first one of all of these things that we've done? I said, I did most of the first ones. And so it's been helpful, actually. 2 of our 10 are engineers. And I think it's I think it's super valuable to have a foot in both worlds, to know both languages. But I think that I couldn't stress more. Obviously, I'm biased, but engineers, assuming these roles in medicine, because it does give you. Engineers are taught to solve problems and are taught to question everything, right? And surgeons are taught to question nothing and do what they're trained to do, right? It's a totally different mindset, but if you have somebody who can do both, it's incredibly valuable. And some of our best advances have come from engineers who are not surgeons, who understand the problem well enough and can say, hey, wait a minute, why would you do it that way? Why wouldn't you do it this way? And it's a much better solution. So that cross-training can be incredibly valuable.
It's cross-training plus learning to communicate with each other effectively, I think, is a real piece. And we do call that out in the National Academy report, that there are going to be gaps in training. The other piece is that, going back to the data engineers and being able to, data architects that will facilitate timely delivery of some of these, timely being, perhaps pre-op, post-op is enough for you.
Yeah.
There are other digital twins that might need minute-to-minute updates, and so those differences in the delivery of the data will also require different team members to join.
Back here.
Hi, Morgan. Thank you so much for the panel. You mentioned a few problems. One is data, right? We need more data for the digital twins, trust, and funding. And I'm wondering if there's any aspect of your work that's building towards like a consumer-based device before you get to like serious disease, but kind of this idea of like preventative medicine that could engage consumers, users, like earlier on to get that kind of early adoption, early funding from kind of outside sources before you launch more into deeper disease data sets.
I can talk with the partnership I have with CX Therapeutics. So actually, this is a great story. I met a maternal fetal medicine specialist when I was a graduate student at MIT. He was a physics undergrad and kind of understood the mechanical forces of what was going on in pregnancy, and he walked across the Charles River, and he's like, I think this is a mechanical problem. I'm going to work with mechanical engineers to understand the cervix. And that was 25 years ago. Come full circle, he introduced the problem to me as a mechie, and I didn't even know what my cervix was as a mechie undergrad, and then I launched into this like women's health project, and actually he would just finish delivering 24-week twins. And as a 20-year-old girl, I was like, what, that happens? And I went to the NICU with him, and as an engineer, I was like, no, this is insane, and where's the technology here? So come full circle, he has a startup now looking at how do we improve that cerclage device I was talking about, like the dental floss in pulling it. Is there a device that we can design to mitigate all those intense stress concentrations that we feel when we pull a suture tight? You have a soft tissue that's very compliant. It likes to biologically remodel a lot. Devices also can be ladders for infection. So before we have full-blown digital twins that can predict preterm birth, he's like, you know what, Kristen, I need to design a device just to prevent it, where I'm at the front line. So we're using digital twins, helping him de-risk all different kinds of biomedical device design ideas. And I feel like that this, to me, in like my career, feels obtainable, that we can have an improved device that's better than what's in clinical gold standard right now. So we're hoping, am I going to solve the 1 in 10 preterm births? No, not right now. I'm hoping the engineers that I train will, who maybe will become physicians. But I think in the biomedical device and providing these digital twins to these femtech companies, and actually other femtech companies have approached me for my digital library of cervix, because if they want a new barrier method for contraception, how to redesign the tenaculum device, for IUD insertion. So a lot of these companies are coming to me and they're like, hey, I just need like a grasp of what size and shape the uterus and cervix is and how it's, packaged in the vaginal canal. So that's a lot of fun I've been having right now. And like, I don't make devices myself, but I think, again, the digital twin platform, again, lowers the barrier of access to a bunch of really cool femtech CEOs to be like, oh, I can de-risk product ideas in this digital twin platform. And that's some excitement I'm seeing right now.
I think to your point, though, there are there's a lot of fit for purpose. So you could do things like, I don't know, I'm just brainstorming here, someone can steal this idea and go and commercialize it. Could you work on someone's posture? And you could actually, the skeleton is something we can actually do. You could actually get your own skeleton designed, and then you could work on, motivating someone to do certain exercises or sitting a certain way, and then seeing if you actually improve your posture over time. And that's totally doable, right? And it's very consumer facing. So that's just like a very simple example, but there's probably 1,000 different ideas like that. The one thing that we have found is that if you engage people while they're healthy, and you can actually get them to really think through the consent of their data being utilized for this purpose, it is the best point in time to engage people. It's really difficult for us to actually engage, and your head's already full, you've just been given a terrible diagnosis, and now we're saying, well, we also need to have consents of this, that, and the other. That's not the optimal timing if we can actually do it. And so we like to try to engage people when they're coming for their screening tests, right? Because that's when you're actually just thinking about the future and how would you actually want to utilize your data for your own benefits as well as benefits of others around you. So.
And David, any last words in our final
Yeah,
seconds?
no, I think we've used the 3D models for family education. Congenital heart disease is complicated, and often the families are like, I don't know, whatever you say, but it really involves engagement with them, and so that for them seeing their own child's heart in 3D and understanding the problems has been monumental. And they say, I feel like I finally understand what's going on with my child, and I understand what you're proposing to do, and we've just scratched the surface of how powerful that can be. But I think a lot of in a lot of areas of medicine, that can be a huge way to involve the patients and family and be really impactful in addition to the medical care.
So really alleviate that anxiety or help alleviate that anxiety, educating them on what's going to happen, what's happening now. That's very, very important. But I want to thank you guys for being here. Again, I'll never use doppelganger again. It'll be digital twins. And I appreciate it. And thank everybody for being here as well.
Thank you.